The BBC has not showered itself in glory when covering the sexual abuses committed by Jeffrey Epstein and the alleged abuses committed by his friends. Most recently, after Ghislaine Maxwell was found guilty of sex trafficking, they invited on Alan Dershowitz as an expert commentator. They failed to point out he was also accused of abuse. Then, after Prince Andrew reached a multi-million-pound settlement with his accuser, the BBC's response has once again raised eyebrows. This was the analysis of BBC royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell.
What of Andrew's future? Could there possibly be a route back to a public role? I have to say it's hard right now to see one. He's been shown to have had such poor judgment, such poor choice of friends. And the brutal fact is, would anyone actually want him? Would any charities, any regiments and so on want to be associated with him after all of this, for all that there's no admission of liability? Perhaps the answer is, as he says at the end of this statement, for him, as he says, to pledge to support the fight against the evils of sex trafficking and by supporting its victims. Perhaps that offers the best, perhaps even the only route back for him.
I watched that comment live on the 6 o'clock news and it just, like, my jaw dropped. You know, the immediate response from the BBC's most high-profile royal correspondent to Prince Andrew settling with someone who has accused him of sexual abuse is to say, well, maybe he could find a way back to public life by becoming a campaigner for the rights of the victims of sex trafficking.
I mean, it would be an absolute insult. And I don't think that any serious media outlet or charity would be complicit in that kind of rehabilitation strategy. And, you know, I'll leave that comment there. Obviously, if he really wanted to help the victims of sex trafficking, then it doesn't need all of this pageantry. It doesn't need all of this PR. He could have just saved the public purse 12 million quid and just gone and told the court what he knew. Or maybe he could have not indulged in some of the most misogynistic, horrific narratives that prevent so many victims of sex trafficking and victims of sexual abuse from actually speaking up about what's happened to them. Maybe he couldn't have platformed and indulged in those narratives in possibly the most public sex trafficking trial of our generation. So it is shocking and entitled and horrific. But I think we have, and you know, you talk about your jaw being open when you saw that on the BBC, and that was the BBC's royal correspondent, I believe. We have a really big problem in this country, which is that a major part of our state, the head of state, the monarchy, has essentially an informal contract with the media that prevents journalists from reporting unfavorable or prying stories. So stories and narratives that the monarchy doesn't want out there. There is that kind of informal contract between those two, between the media and a certain part of our state. That's really concerning. And obviously that's been true for a really long time. But I think it's in cases like these that we realize how strong and how damaging that informal relationship is, you know. And I mean, I'm not taking everything from the Harry, Meghan and Oprah interview as my theory of the British state, but I do think that interview did give us some insight into how that relationship between the UK media and the monarchy operates, and the idea that the monarchy kind of has this ongoing bargaining relationship with the press to the point where they can say, okay, we don't want you to report on this, so we'll give you this story, or we'll give you this sort of bogus narrative about the darkest skinned person that we have in our ranks as a kind of compromise. That the interview really shed light on how that informal relationship operates. And I think that for people that say they live in a democracy, that's pretty incompatible with this kind of exceptionalism that the monarchy operates on. And it becomes really difficult to indulge in the kind of, oh, you know, these are just symbolic. It's just symbolic. It's just something that people enjoy. The monarchy is harmless. It becomes really difficult to defend that narrative when you see what is actually happening in these kind of key moments where the relationship between a key part of our state and the British media is exposed. And that's where this absurd clip that we've just seen, that's the kind of context that this is emerging from.
I watched quite a lot of the coverage of this yesterday on the BBC, and Nicholas Witchell's statement that Andrew could potentially find his way back into public life by becoming a high-profile campaigner for the victims of sex abuse. I think that probably was the most ridiculous thing that was said on the network. But the coverage across the BBC I found pretty problematic, because the question of whether Andrew can return to public life was consistently given more attention than the rights of potential victims of sex trafficking. This was how the settlement was covered on Newsnight.
Drawing a line under the furore will be a huge relief to him and the royal family, not least during the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, when a string of scandalous allegations would have overshadowed the celebrations.
Well, I'm sure that in the palace everybody will be very relieved that this has been settled, because it avoids an unseemly case with lots more tabloid-style details, such as we've already seen quite a lot of.
But his involvement is likely to be damaging for years to come. It's hard to see any charity or military unit wanting to be associated with him.
I think the damage has been done, and it's very hard to see a way that Prince Andrew would return to the sort of royal duties and things that he was doing before, because so many unpleasant details have come out over the last months. And in a sense, I don't think anybody really wants him. I don't think it would be a benefit for them. So he'll have to try and find something different to do.
So Prince Andrew could face a future life of near total public invisibility, never having had a chance to prove his claims of innocence.
So Prince Andrew could face a future life of near total public invisibility, never having had a chance to prove his claims of innocence. He did have a chance. He could have gone to court. He could have given a deposition. He decided to settle out of court. And now we're saying, poor Andrew, he didn't get the chance to prove his innocence. He signed the deal. He didn't need to settle, right? He settled because he didn't want to stand up and have his dirty laundry aired in the public domain, right? Now, I don't know if he's guilty of this particular charge, but I can assume that there were things that he didn't want to talk about because he's embarrassed about them. And sort of, we know from the way he has talked in that Newsnight interview, we know from his, long-term association with Jeffrey Epstein, that presumably the guy has done a bunch of things, made a bunch of decisions that most of the British public will find completely objectionable. And now we say, he didn't get the chance to prove his innocence. And Dahlia, my question for you here is, how distasteful do you think it is how quickly all of the coverage of this, instead of sort of, because there are lots of interesting questions that you could be informing the public about, settlements, what do settlements mean for the rights of potential victims? Is this justice? Instead, no one on the BBC could help within like 2.5 minutes going, how's this going to affect Andrew? Is he going to be able to come back to public life soon? It's sort of like the obvious answer to that is no. So let's talk about something more relevant.
The world's tiniest violin just scraping away in the corners of the BBC for Prince Andrew. I mean, what struck me about this entire saga and the footage that you just aired, and it's such an obvious point that it's almost banal. Like, I'm almost embarrassed to make it because it's so obvious, which is just the sheer entitlement. Like, the sense that not being able to be publicly adored by your subjects and move around freely without scrutiny and set your own narratives in the public eye, that not being able to have that right is somehow like an unfair or premature punishment that Andrew is facing. And that self-pity is honestly, there's so many distasteful things about this story, but the self-pity is one of the things that I just find so unbearable here, because it's come throughout the entire process. It came through when he in how he has spoken about himself in the press, and how his sort of avatars have spoken about him in the press. And we saw it when he was asked that very simple question by Emily Maitlis. Do you regret your associations with a convicted paedophile and sex trafficker? And he thought it would be wise to say, well, the first thing that came to his mind was, well, no, because, I gained a lot of connections and I learned a lot of things through my friendship with him. And that kind of delusion and entitlement tells me so much, because he assumes that the expansion of his mind and his networks is something that we all care about. It's something that we would all obviously recognize as something that is a priority or even equivocal to the dignity and safety of children. And it really, when he said that, I remember thinking, does he think that we are all invested in his personal intellectual enrichment? Does he think that we all seriously care about this? And the truth is that that's what he has been told his whole life. It's what all people who have inherited and assumed forms of power are told all their lives. And it's what we are told by our media implicitly that we should also believe as well. And obviously, I think that falls pretty flat on most people. But I think that is, of all of the abhorrent details that have come out and all of the things that we have learned about the nature of the monarchy in this country, that's one of the things that has really stuck with me because it is just so far away from any world I have ever occupied. But yeah, it's just pretty embarrassing for him and embarrassing for us, frankly, for all of us as people who have let this farce continue for so long.
No, I think that point actually about him thinking that his own intellectual development is more important than the sex trafficking, which obviously he denies he was involved in, is super important. Like, history used to be written like this, who would be the tutor of the prince would be sort of something of world historical importance, and correctly training the prince to sort of be able to govern would be incredibly important. Obviously, it doesn't matter a jot now, but he still lives in a world where it does.